What implications does this mean for Putin's calculus? Because Crimea's always had a particular meaning to him, not just in the war, but overall. So if the Ukrainians continue to really put pressure on the peninsula in such a way, like, what does he resort to? What options does he have to try to mitigate, let alone reverse Ukraine's impacts there?
Look, he'll try to find workarounds. He'll try to, do more resupplies through the land bridge, which is also now getting struck by the Ukrainians at a great rate. But he's going to hang on. Look, he's not about to give up on this thing. He's still seeing advances by his forces, right? He's still seeing captures of these villages in the Donbass that no one can point out on the map, but nevertheless, sound great in his mind. And the reports that he's getting are clearly embellished significantly. So the progress that they're making is probably multiplied by 10 in the reports to him. But he still believes, and he's been told by his military, this is what I hear from my Ukrainian sources, that they're going to capture the Donbass by the end of the year.
This is The Global Gambit.
How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to the channel. You're watching The Global Gambit. We had a part one with Dmitri Alperovitch, chairman of Silverado Policy Accelerator. It was a bit of a tongue twister, that. And now we're coming to Ukraine. Now, if you haven't seen part one, go and see that, because I challenged Dmitri on some of the points he made, and I think it was good. But this one, Dmitri, you were going to go to Kiev for a conversation with Fedorov, with some of the defense ministry and other personnel. And then we've had this chaotic week of Fedorov being dismissed, and now we've had in the past 24 hours a reshuffling, shall we say, or reallocation of the top tier, including the commander-in-chief, commander of the armed forces. So take me through what you were going to be doing, if that's possible, or sort of how this has changed and your overall sort of reflections to it.
Yeah, no, I was going to do another visit. I was literally hours away from boarding the flight, and I was starting to get notifications that all my meetings were getting canceled because people were getting fired or resigning or concerned about their jobs and didn't want to talk to anyone. So, I ended up pulling the trip at the last minute because it just seemed like the wrong time to go if you actually want to talk to people on the ground that have a sense of how things are going. Look, big shakeup here, and again, it's something that we'll see how it turns out. But the fact that Fedorov was dismissed, I think, is widely seen as not a good thing. He was a modernizing force within the Ministry of Defense, focused on reforming procurement, focusing on improving mobilization, focusing on, frankly, tackling some of the corruption that is so pervasive in the defense sector and really across the country. And that's also part of why he was fired, I think. He was seen as touching on too many interests of entrenched interests, both in the military and across the defense sector, economic sector. And then I think also part of it was that Zelensky was increasingly jealous of his popularity and viewing him as a potential political rival down the road and wanted to clip his wings and get rid of him. Very similar to what he did with Zelensky some years back, if you recall. Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces that he dismissed. Now, because of how popular Fedorov was, and because Fedorov came out and gave this long press conference and talking about all the accomplishments that he's had since just joining earlier this year in the Defense Ministry, and all of his plans for reform that were widely seen as smart and having a lot of importance attached to them. There were protests in Kiev. There continue to be protests even as we speak. And because it was also seen as this confrontation between Syrsky, the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, and Fedorov, and Syrsky widely regarded as this old Soviet, general that is very top-down in his approach, rules by fear, very, very unpopular across the armed forces, across Ukrainian society. By the way, he's a Russian, right? Native Russian, born in Russia. He's got brother and parents in Russia, so kind of an ironic situation that the head of the Ukrainian military is literally a Russian with family in Russia. But as a result of these protests, as a result of Fedorov really making it a conflict between him and Syrsky in public, Zelensky dismissed Syrskyi literally yesterday, appointed Drapatny, who is seen as a much more modern, much younger leader, was a hero of the Maidan movement when he led the BMP forces into Mariupol that was getting taken over by the Russian insurgents back then, and sort of recaptured the city and save it for Ukraine, at least for the time. He's got his own issues, he's a little volatile and very direct, which could be good, but he's now the head of the armed forces, certainly seen widely as an improvement from Syrskyi. But there's still a question of what happens to Fedorov. And Zelensky has tried to basically, resolve this issue by offering Fedorov some other job, creating a new position that probably would have very little power, but sort of placating the street. By doing that, Fedorov is rejecting that and basically saying, it's my old job or nothing. Zelensky is digging in. If he brings Fedorov in, he for sure looks even weaker than he already is by conceding and firing Syrskyi. So it's unclear, if either side is going to compromise. I'm hearing sort of from both camps that they're wondering about the other. Is one going to blink first? A little bit like the Iran-U.S. standoff over the strait. But Zelensky dug this hole, and he's got to dig himself out of it. And we'll see how it turns out.
Yeah, just on that point, actually, because I think it's quite interesting. There's two ways I can sort of look at this. Now, I'm not an intricate expert on the intricacies of the Ukrainian government structure, but on the one hand, it looks reassuring for Zelensky because he is listening to democracy. Democracy, this is the main point I made in a video I made recently. Democracy functions in Ukraine, much like we saw with those adjustments he wanted to make to the intelligence agencies, I think it was last year. He backtracked, and that's good because even during wartime, democracy works. But on the other hand, is it not a bit disconcerting that he's trying to remove a young guy who is quite very popular amongst the Ukrainian population? He's young, he's innovative, etc. Is it not a bit concerning that Zelensky is removing people who potentially challenge him because he wants to remain in power longer? How do you look at this sort of balancing act of his?
Of course it is. And beyond, look, every, Democratic leader, and frankly, even not Democratic leaders, view things through the prism of politics, right? You think Lincoln didn't think about politics during the Civil War. Of course, you think about politics if you're a politician. But beyond that, his personnel choices throughout this war have not been great, to say the least, right? The appointment of Syrskyi, widely derided in the armed forces, total disaster. Keeping Yermak, widely seen as this great cardinal, corrupt, pulling the strings in the Ukrainian government for so long. And even now I'm hearing that Yermak had a lot to do with the firing of Fedorov, right? Even though he's now kind of private citizen. So not great choices by Zelensky at all. I don't think that the prosecution of this war, frankly, has gone as well as it could have. They waited way too long. We've talked many times on the show, I think, about the need for Ukraine to do these deep strikes, to build up its own defense industrial base and not rely on America and the West. The fact that it's only happening now, in the fifth year of the war, is just mind-boggling, right? Why didn't this happen 3 years ago? Waited too long on a lot of these things. The counteroffensive in 2023 was ill-conceived. The fight for Bakhmut, where they lost so many good people. The invasion of Kursk, which was a total disaster. They lost so many people, so much equipment, achieved absolutely nothing. All of these things have not been great decision-making by Zelensky, and these were decisions by Zelensky. So, he's obviously been good on sort of mobilizing world support for Ukraine, great communicator, standing strong and not leaving Kiev in the early days of the war. Very, very important, but also has done quite a bit to, I think, mismanage this war. So you're right. This decision is one in a long series of decisions that are, if not highly questionable, really detrimental to Ukraine's interests.
Yeah, he's spent much of this week with military commanders, political aides, whatever, trying to find a way through this situation. But what is interesting is that Fedorov has rejected an offer to return. So what
A
is
return
this?
to a different role. I think if he were
Sure.
offered to return to his current role, I think he would take it. But this creation of a new position with very vague responsibilities is clearly just a way to placate the street and actually not give him any power.
So let's look at this from a sort of thematic standpoint then. What does this tell us about the general culture in the military / political arms of Ukraine? Because obviously a lot of the senior posted individuals were formed under the Soviet doctrine and those sort of age. But now we've got this younger generation of people who are being formed around this war with Russia, drones, cybernetics, information warfare. How do you look at this sort of shift here? Is it how much can the Ukrainians capitalize on it?
Yeah, I mean, it tells you a lot about how massively Russia has screwed up this war, that they are not capturing huge amounts of territory despite all these issues that Ukraine is having, right, and has had in its leadership. Look, thankfully, there are still leaders in the military, young leaders that are taking initiative, that are being innovative and experimenting. What will hopefully happen under Drapatny is a lot of these experimentations that are taking place in different parts of the front will be looked at more systematically, will be supported from Kiev, will be dispersed across the entire front line so that, what happens in one chunk of the front line can those lessons learned can now be broadly adopted. That was not at all happening under Syrskyi. So hopefully Drapatny will take a look at this and fix it. But you need the support of the defense ministry for this as well. So who will be ultimately in charge of the defense ministry? How much leeway they will have in firing people that are still across the military? You still have a lot of Syrskyi supporters, people that he's promoted, that have his way of thinking, that can undermine a lot of these initiatives. So, we're not out of the woods here yet in terms of the reforms that need to take place, and hopefully they will take place. But it's still a big question about their success.
I am curious. Let's just get your. Well, we haven't had you on for quite a while, and since you can really up the ante with these long-range strike capabilities, I mean, take me through your thoughts. We've had the Wildberries attack. We've had various strikes across Moscow now, St. Petersburg, obviously, earlier in the year, right during the International Economic Forum. Like, how big a deal psychologically, let alone kinetically, is this for Ukraine, as well as Russia, in terms of the impact?
I think it's important. It's obviously very symbolic, and it's bringing the war directly to Moscow, to St. Petersburg, in the way that we hadn't really seen. There were a few, drone strikes, but this is now much bigger scale and much more impactful. The attacks on the oil infrastructure and the refineries, I think, are much more impactful. Right, we've seen the huge shortages of gasoline and now diesel increasingly across the country. They're trying to mitigate some of that, so you're seeing fewer gas lines in Moscow and St. Petersburg because they're doing the traditional thing that Russia always does, which is steal from the regions, give it to the two cosmopolitan cities to alleviate the problem, and who cares about the rest of the country. They're also going to try to do other things like import gas they're already importing from Belarus. They'll probably try to get it from Central Asia as well to try to reduce the shortages. But, this is going to have a significant economic hit. And of course, it's not just about gas, it's fertilizer, it's all kinds of things that, in the agricultural sector, they're going to be impacted by this. Delivery, right? The cost of delivery will go up because of the cost of transportation that's going up. The hits on the export infrastructure for crude oil, if that scales up, can have an impact on their Russian budget. So the Ukrainians now are creating more and more dilemmas for the Russian economy and the Russian population, which is good. It's not enough to get Putin to stop. And in the short term, it can kind of even bolster his case a little bit of these are terrorists, as he calls them. They're hitting us. This is why we're prosecuting this war, right? Totally forgetting, of course, that he's the one that launched this and created this problem to begin with. But consistency has never been his strong suit. But I think the much bigger military effects have actually been in occupied Ukraine itself. And there are two things that are happening that are getting sort of less attention because it's not as, interesting as watching the video of a Wildberries warehouse going up in Moscow, but much more critically important. And that is the strikes in Crimea, first and foremost, that have basically isolated Crimea. So they've hit the ferries, they've hit electricity infrastructure throughout Crimea, and obviously the gas stations and other distribution points as well, which is massively impacting life on the peninsula, right? So they basically managed to isolate it. There's still, of course, a bridge across the Kerch Bridge across to the mainland, to the Russian mainland. But the Russians, since the attack on that bridge early on in the war, have restricted military and gas from going across that bridge, right? So they were relying on ferries and other infrastructure that the Ukrainians have now hit to transport that because they were afraid of a repeat where, they hit a fuel train going across that bridge and cause damage to the bridge. So they don't want to see a repeat of that. And as a result, they've now doing inspections of trucks crossing. They don't want anything flammable in those trucks that can go up in smoke. So those things have made the situation worse. And in particular, what I think people are not paying attention to is the water crisis. So Crimea is a very arid peninsula. It has always relied on supplies of water from external sources. So there was this Crimean Canal that was built during the Soviet times that the Ukrainians cut off after Crimea was occupied by Russia in 2014. When the Russians reinvaded in 2022, they opened it back up. But ironically, when they blew up the Kakhovka dam, that canal went dry. So they cut the water supplies off again. And what they've been doing in the meantime is drilling these very, very deep wells to get water out that are powered by electricity. And as the Ukrainians are hitting the substations across Crimea, those wells are going offline, right? So there's now a big water shortage in Crimea. And look, you can survive without a lot of things. You can survive without gas. You can survive without electricity. You cannot survive without water. And the situation is getting quite dire there. Lots and lots of people are trying to leave the peninsula. Now, the military is still staying, and they're going to get the prioritization on all the resources that remain, water, gas, etc. But this is, creating real pressures and real challenges for Putin with regards to keeping Crimea. So that's one thing that's really important. The second thing is what's been going on with these mid-range strikes in other parts of the Donbass, where the Ukrainians have dramatically scaled these operations when they're out hitting 30, 50 kilometers behind the front lines, hitting logistics points for Russia, dramatically curtailing their ability to resupply forces and dramatically slowing down their advances. Now, it's still important to say that the Russians are still advancing. Despite all the successes that we've just talked about, they're still capturing territory. Much, much slower than they used to, much greater costs, but they're still moving and advancing, which I think is all that matters for Putin in the near term. But it's by no question having a great effect at slowing them down.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to get into Crimea, but you've done a thorough job of breaking that down. I guess simply to follow on with that, Dmitri, what implications does this mean for Putin's calculus? Because Crimea has always had a particular meaning to him, not just in the war, but overall. So if the Ukrainians continue to really put pressure on the peninsula in such a way, like, what does he resort to? What options does he have to try to mitigate, let alone reverse, Ukraine's impacts there?
Look, he'll try to find workarounds. He'll try to do more resupplies through the land bridge, which is also now getting struck by the Ukrainians at a great rate. But he's going to hang on. Look, he's not about to give up on this thing. And again, like as he's still seeing advances by his forces, right? He's still seeing captures of these villages in the Donbass that no one can point out on the map, but nevertheless, sound great in his mind that he can proclaim yet another village being captured. and the reports that he's getting are clearly embellished significantly. So the progress that they're making is probably multiplied by 10 in the reports to him. But he still believes, and he's been told by his military, this is what I hear from my Ukrainian sources, that they're going to capture the Donbass by the end of the year. That's what they're promising to Putin. There's not a chance in hell that's going to happen. But as long as he believes that, he'll keep going. And I think he thinks that the winter will be very brutal for Ukraine, and he's probably right. Right, the shortage of interceptors, Patriot interceptors, is a huge problem. And the Russians literally just last week launched the biggest assault in Kiev of the entire war, over 40 missiles, hundreds of drones. Things are getting very, very uncomfortable in Kiev. And, just talking to friends there, people that would never go into shelters are now going to shelters, every few days, because these missiles are now striking everywhere and killing people. And this is happening not just in Kiev, but of course across the country as well. And it's summertime, in the winter, it's going to be much worse and much colder. So, Putin has these ideas that he's going to break the will of the Ukrainian society. He won't, but he can inflict a lot of pain on them. So I think, this war will continue at least through the winter. Now, next year, once we get past the winter, he will have, very hard decisions to make about how to sustain this economically, how to sustain this militarily. He'll likely have to do another mobilization if he's going to keep advancing, which will be very unpopular. But he may very well do it. But, it gets harder and harder to keep at it. And I don't rule out that, maybe next summer, maybe even in the spring, we might get to an actual ceasefire because the pressures that are building are becoming unsustainable.
Well, yeah, on this point, I mean, look, isn't this indicative of two things? Putin's micromanagement, he's growing paranoia over certain things. He's increased his own security detail. These are massive Achilles heel, more than the Russian Soviet doctrine machine itself. But to that end also, like $90 million per square mile. That's the assessment I've heard from some places. That's how much it's costing the Russians to take territory. And the Ukrainians with these strikes, every strike is a reminder to the Russians and citizens that this war is coming more and more to home. You've got more Russians taking cash out and keeping it out of the system because they no longer trust the system. Like, isn't this just a compounding set of effects, everything getting worse for Putin? Yes, I'm aware of the limitations, concerns with Ukrainians, but surely this is just a matter of time at this point.
Yeah, it is. And all these things, starting with sanctions and so forth, none of them are enough to break the system. But it's like gravity, right? It's increasing the weight on the shoulders of the Russian economy, the Russian military, making it harder and harder to keep prosecuting this war. They're still able to, do the shell game and move resources and figure out a way to keep at it. But every single day, every single month, the choice is narrow. And at some point, they're going to hit a wall, no question about it. And I'm convinced that we're much closer to the end of this war than we are to the beginning, but we're not there yet. And I don't think we'll be there this year.
But what gives first, though? What does the Europeans need to do specifically? I'll focus on them because they're largely funding Ukraine completely now. So what difference do these two sets of the loan given in January, the 75 billion extra now, what difference do these make to the Ukrainian fortunes as we enter this, full winter period?
Well, they're crucial. Without that, they would not be able to sustain this war. Like, just point blank, without the salaries, without the military equipment, Ukraine would lose. So that aid is absolutely crucial for the survival of the country and for continuing to prosecute the conflict. And what was important about the statements this summer is not even the amount, but the sentiment that this is going to continue for as long as it takes, right? That we're committing not just for this year, but next year, and if necessary, going forward as well. Now, politics can change, right? President Biden famously declared that we'll support you as long as it takes. President Trump comes into office and things change, right? So if you have Marie Le Pen winning in France, if you have AfD at some point winning in Germany, like who knows what's going to happen to Ukrainian support? But at least for now, that seems to be locked in, and that's really important as a signal to Putin that you're not going to outlast them. We're going to keep at it, and he still has hopes, and he's looking at election maps just like we are, and hoping that some of these populists that might win in Europe will change things up in terms of European aid. But he, as I said, like every day things get tougher for him, and the ability to keep extending some of these hard decisions, the room to maneuver is just closing.
So if you are perhaps to go to Kiev later this year, meet the new military defense political system that exists there, what would you be advising? What would you want to be seeing the Ukrainians doing, as well as Europe or something?
Well, look, and it's important to say, like, they've made a lot of progress this year in particular. You look at where they were last year, mobilization was not going well, the drone production was not where it needed to be. A lot of these improvements have been made. Fyodor was a key part of that, not the only one, but certainly a very important piece of that. You want to see what they can do to fix the air defense problem, right? They've done really, really well on Shaheds. Shaheds are a much smaller problem now, despite their numbers, than they had been, because the interception rates are so high. Eric Schmidt was a key part of that. The company that he's built is one of the top interceptor companies for Shaheds, but there are a number of indigenous Ukrainian companies that are very good at this. What they don't have an answer to is ballistic missiles. They can intercept cruise missiles with F-16s and some other air defense systems, but ballistics, the only system that can do this effectively is the Patriots. The SAM-T system that the French has provided has not performed well. Maybe they can improve it. They're trying to get some feedback from Ukraine and make some adjustments, but they also don't have mass production of interceptors. So even if they get that system working, it's probably not going to add a lot to the ability to intercept these ballistic missiles. Production of Patriot missiles, interceptors, is highly limited. Demand for it all over the world. Taiwanese want it. Obviously, all of the Middle East wants it. U.S. needs it. All European countries want it. So very, very difficult to see how Ukraine is going to get tons and tons of more Patriot interceptors in the short term. I don't think that's in the cards. And even though they're getting, supposedly, Trump has agreed to allow them to produce Patriot interceptors, that's going to take years. We're really talking probably about a post-war Ukraine having ability to manufacture Patriot interceptors, not something that's going to change the dynamics for this conflict. So can they develop solutions for it indigenously? This is a very, very hard problem technically. You have Firepoint, probably one of the top missile companies in Ukraine that is building these longer range Flamingo missiles that are hitting Russia, talking about being able to intercept ballistic missiles. We will see if that actually happens, but that's sort of the big question right now, is what can they do against these larger and larger onslaughts that the Russians are firing at them. They're really, starting to impact life in Kyiv in a way that we haven't seen since early days of this war.
Well, some sobering but perhaps tentatively optimistic assessments there, Dmitri. Thank you so much for your time. Everyone, if you don't know Dmitri's work, then do, of course, go and check it out. You can find a book that he wrote, I think, a couple of years ago now, on Blood on the Brink, between China and the US, which I'll link in the description. And, I wish you a good rest of the summer, everyone. Subscribe if you haven't already, and we'll see you all very soon. Take care.
Thank you.